thank you very much for the generous introduction, Pamela, and I also want to especially thank Graham Nixon. This is the, I think, third time that I will have had the privilege of speaking at the studio school, and it will never cease being an honor, so thank you very much. And on one more personal note, I fell in love with 18th century French painting as an undergraduate at Smith College. And then as a graduate student at the Institute of Fine Arts, I had the privilege of studying with Robert Rosenblum. And I know that he was a frequent, probably lecturer here as well as audience member here. And he's the one who really turned me on to the art of Jacques-Louis David. So in some ways, I hope tonight I can live up to his inimitable example, if only in a small way. So, with that, becoming Jacques-Louis David. Here we see David, the father of the entire modern school in painting and sculpture, to borrow the words of Eugène Delacroix. How did David come to earn that distinction from one of the most influential 19th century painters? That will be the subject of my talk tonight. But before we talk about David the artist, I think it's important to get a little bit of a sense of David the man. So for that, I've conjured up revolutionarymatch.com. If David were to describe himself in a personal ad, it might read as follows. I'm a successful artist and teacher, age 46, divorced, 6 feet tall, penetrating gaze. Stylish, even a bit of a dandy. Ardent Republican, community organizer. I am well-versed in classical literature, love Homer and ancient history. I can be impulsive, hot-tempered, and prone to bouts of melancholy. Excitable enough to need careful handling, an artist friend once described me. Some call me a sore loser, perhaps because I once attempted suicide by starvation after losing a student competition. I say I'm just intensely driven. Oh, and I'm currently incarcerated, so if you like bad boys, ha, wink, wink. So, anyway, but it's funny, but it's also true. I mean, every bit of that description is either an 18th century quote or from a biography of David or a memoir of one of his contemporaries. So I was just having a little fun with the facts. But back to David's self-portrait. He painted this self-portrait in 1794 during his imprisonment after the fall of Robespierre, the radical leader of the bloody reign of terror. And David had only days before proclaimed his undying loyalty to Robespierre, saying, if you drink hemlock, I will drink it with you. And trust me, you don't want to drink hemlock or you die a long, slow death. But that was David, a little bit of bad timing for that statement. To paint this portrait, he was aided by a small mirror brought to him by a student. And he captured his likeness, palette and brush in hand. And take note of, on the screen, the cheek to the left. And actually, because he used a mirror, it actually was his left cheek that was swollen due to the reversal of using a mirror. You all who are artists, you can wrap your head around that. The consequence, this swollen cheek was the consequence of a youthful duel gone awry, which left him with a serious speech impediment for the rest of his life. However, that didn't stop him from doing a lot of public speaking. Not averse to a bit of idealization, David paints himself to look younger than his 46 years. David's self-portrait reminds us that his art became inextricably linked with the vicissitudes of French politics at the onset of the French Revolution in 1789. Tonight, I will focus on his career trajectory from his student works through the turbulent decade that followed the Revolution of 1789. I will emphasize his seminal history paintings, as these are the works in which David asserted himself as the undisputed master of the Neoclassical style. But the man who painted the Oath of the Hermitage, which you see on the screen, in Rome in 1784-85, was no overnight sensation. In fact, he was more like a 15-year sensation. So don't give up. It takes more than, being an overnight hit. Perseverance. And on that note, this work is a case in point. It's a student work from 1771, the first of his 4 attempts to win the coveted Prix de Rome Fellowship, awarded for 3 to 5 years of study in Rome. Unfortunately, this painting of the combat of Mars and Minerva, a subject from Homer's Iliad, was only good enough for second prize. According to the judges, and I think you can be the judge here as well, David had some problems with anatomy and gesture. I mean, look at that gesture of, like, Minerva. I mean, really, how authoritative is that kind of limp-wristed gesture? Stylistically, this painting has more in common with Boucher's Rococo fantasies than with the cutting-edge classicism of Vilain, David's teacher. Both the pastel palette and the cloud-born Venus, and you can see Venus hovering over the scene, harken back to the Rococo style, which, by this date, 1771, had fallen out of favor in more progressive artistic circles. But here we are still very much entrenched in the world of mythology, in the loves of the gods. And just to give you a little reminder about Boucher and the Rococo, here's a kind of quintessential Boucher, The Triumph of Venus, 1740. And, you know, look at the palette, the nude Venus, the sort of frou-frou-ness. And I think you can see David's really still very much immersed in the Rococo. Certainly, that's in 1771. So that was his first try at the Prix de Rome. Here's his second attempt. 1772, 1 year later. David submitted this operatic confection, drawn not from Homer, this time Ovid's Metamorphoses. However, David would lose once again, this time to a friend whose painting was more pleasing in color, so said the judges. However, the circumstances surrounding his second defeat provoked that failed suicide attempt I mentioned earlier. David locked himself into a room, refusing to eat or drink. This, however, lasted for all of 2.5 days before someone talked him out of doing it and unlocked the door, and out came David. So I think that whole episode is very insightful to David's character as well as his competitive nature. So that was 1772. Now fast forward to 1774. With this painting, David finally won the Prix de Rome. And his response? This is the first time in 4 years that I have been able to draw a breath. David's composition condenses 2 different moments of a story into a single scene. And you can see the protagonist is the figure seated in the bed. That's Antiochus. He's a young Syrian prince. And to his left is seated the doctor. And Antiochus is suffering from love sickness. Namely, he's in love with his hot stepmother, and you can see her on the far right side of the composition in white. So, how to solve this seemingly incurable malady, you might be wondering? Well, Antiochus's father, who's standing right behind the stepmother, steps in and gallantly offers to give up his new young wife to his son to cure his son. So, that's the story that David has painted. And it's interesting with its kind of fusion of a kind of soap opera romance, sort of in the guise of classicism, that this work is very much on the cusp of, while it's kind of classical in subject, this sort of underlying current of love, sex, intrigue, very much still has David firmly rooted in the Rococo. And just to remind you again of the date, it's 1774. This narrative economy, though, anticipates David's later works, as does the compositional prominence given to gesture. And by that, I think you can see the gesture of the doctor in the foreground. That said, notice how the scene is crowded with figures, the kind of extras that David would soon eliminate as his compositions became increasingly pared down to focus on the essential actors in a scene. The curtain that you can see in the upper left, another vestige of the Baroque, lends the work a theatrical quality, and David would soon dispense with this compositional device as well. How then did David become the David, the artist who launched a revolution in painting? For that, he had to go to Rome. His 5-year sojourn there, from 1775 to 1780, was a transformative experience. At this time, Rome, and not Paris, was the artistic hub of Europe, and antique art was all the rage among its community of artists and intellectuals. David was in the center of it all as a student at the Palazzo Mancini, the home of the French Academy in Rome. And you can see, this is the Palazzo as etched by Piranesi in 1752, and you can see what a posh residence it is in the very fashionable Via del Corso. And I would imagine it's a little bit like being an artist student in New York today, that it can, I'm sure, be a little bit intimidating, much as the way I'm sure Rome was for David and the other young Bohemian artists who were housed in the Palazzo. However, before David left Paris, he claimed, quote, "The antique will not seduce me. It lacks liveliness and does not move." Well, famous last words, as soon enough, David found himself in Rome heeding the advice of the German art theorist Winckelmann, credited with the rediscovery of ancient Greek art in the 18th century. As Winckelmann wrote, "The sole way for us to become great, and if possible inimitable, is by the imitation of the ancients." And here's a portrait of said Winckelmann by the German artist Mengs, and it's in the collection at the Metropolitan, so you can see it just uptown. And he's holding, appropriately enough, a copy of the Iliad, but of course it's in Greek. So, David's romance with the antique past. Throughout his career, David was a prolific draftsman. His Roman notebooks, some 12 in all, are filled with over 1,000 drawings of antique sculpture, including the sheet that you see in front on the screen. Influenced by his study of classical statuary and his contact with contemporary sculptors in Rome, David adopted a more linear style of drawing, one that emphasized the contour or outlines of forms. And here, the drawing I'm going to focus on is the one on the lower left, the dying Niobids with their nurse from the late 1770s. So here it is. And there I think you can see how pronounced David is making the outline of the figures. And this very much, now to do a comparison, this style was very much a departure from the style of drawing taught in the French Academy, in which form was defined through light and shadow rather than contour. David's style used line both to define forms as well as to suggest volumes, dispensing with the hatching and soft shading taught by the Academy. And there's just a typical Academy or nude study on the right. And a word about David's copies after the antique. They were never ever literal or direct copies. And in his words, he described his copies after the antique, quote, "I seasoned them with modern sauce." So I like the cooking analogy, and I have to say, I've read a lot on art written in the late 18th and early 19th century, and I'm fascinated by the number of cooking metaphors that recur. I think of Turner, whose art, like critics would critique his art and say he used too much mustard in his cooking, and of course that was too much yellow. And then I'm thinking later 19th century French academic artists who their paintings, the sort of kind of brownish old master tonality, they would talk about brown sauce. So there's brown sauce, modern sauce, mustard. I don't know if there's a kind of dissertation in all this or not, but someone else can do it because did mine, and I'm not doing another one. But anyway, back to David. And another drawing. This drawing, after an antique relief, recalls the advice that David credits to a sculptor friend of his in Rome, who told him, quote, "Drawing is all in the line. Put whatever you want inside it." David later described the process of drawing that he developed in Rome as one of distillation to achieve a purity of line and expression. He said, "I made and remade incessantly, beginning at a point of triviality and refining by lines until finally my contours almost had the grandeur, purity, finesse, and grace that I found in beautiful antique figures." Okay, I think I'm stuck. I've frozen. Spacebar? Okay, we'll try that. Nope. Sorry. What Sorry about that. Thank you, Josh. Okay, so David's Roman drawings culminate with this work, whose format is that of an antique sculpted frieze. The subject is likely David's own invention. It is a fragment of a larger drawing, now in two parts. The other shows the funeral procession of a hero who died in battle. And here we see, in the center, the hero dying. And we know he's dying because just to his right, you can see the three fates cutting the thread of life, metaphorically. So he's about to die. The work embodies David's contour style of drawing and shows his use of the body to convey emotion. And this was actually a really major breakthrough in that David focused on the body as a locus of expression and not just on the face. And that was a real departure from teaching in the French Academy in the 18th century. And we'll see that play out as we continue. But of course, when David was in Rome, he wasn't just, crawling around ruins and drawing casts of plaster casts after the antique. He was also very much immersed in more contemporary art in Rome, namely the work of the 17th century painter Caravaggio and his followers. Their paintings were characterized by strong contrasts of light and shadow, chiaroscuro, which defined forms and added drama, as well as an emphatic naturalism. As such, these works marked a significant departure from the clarity and rococo palette reflected in David's early student works, which very much were still done under the influence of Boucher and company. And this, by the way, I chose this Caravaggio because it happens to be my favorite Caravaggio, the Entombment of Christ from the Vatican. But in fact, this Caravaggio found its way to Paris during the Napoleonic Wars. So David would have seen it between 1800 and 1814 in Paris. And he might well have seen it in Italy before then. In 1779, David painted a now lost copy of this work, Valentine de Bologna's Last Supper, and this was done to fulfill a student requirement. As a fourth-year student at the French Academy in Rome, he was required to paint a copy after a work by an old master, and these copies were then sent back to the French king in Paris for the royal collection. So you can imagine it would be like being asked to go to the Met or something and paint something to send to Obama for the White House collection. So that's what David had to do in the 18th century. And this was the work that he chose to copy, and unfortunately, David's copy is now lost. But apparently, again, it was not a literal copy after this, but in fact, David altered the tonality and played up the contrast between light and shade in his version. In addition to these copies of After the Old Masters, students were also required to produce paintings done after live models. These paintings were known as academies. And David transformed this academic exercise into highly original and expressive works, using light and shade to create weight and volume. The sculptural and powerfully expressive form seen in this work of 1778, known as Hector, anticipates what is to come in David's work. And just as a point of reference, this work would hang in David's studio in Paris, which, as you know, was so influential in the 1780s and 1790s. So all of the artists who passed through there, Gérard, Girodet, Ingres, they all would have had this work literally looming over them as they studied under David. And there's a sort of circa 1804 drawing of David's studio, and you can actually see this as well as another academy by David hanging in the background of his studio. So it's clearly a work that David placed a lot of value on. So what's to come after this? Namely, this transformative painting, which David painted during a return trip to Rome in 1784-85. I mean, if you're going to break from the conventions of painting, you may as well go to Rome, which was your source of inspiration in the first place, to execute the transformative work, which is exactly what David did, breaking from the conventions of history painting to chart his own course. He depicts a moment of oath-taking in which three brothers, the Hermitage, swear to their father to fight to the death to defend their country, sacrificing the bonds of family. Now, just by way of background, their sister Camilla, who you can see wilting with grief on the far right, is engaged to one of the enemy brothers, and now fast forward to what happens after this scene. Her fiancé is killed by one of her brothers, and when she mourns her fiancé's loss, her own brother, the one in the foreground left, then kills her, and this is witnessed and sanctioned by their father. So it's a pretty gruesome, dysfunctional family story, if ever there was one. David's portrayal of the grieving women is a foreshadowing of the familial cleavage that follows. David depicts only those figures that are essential to the story and places them in a frieze-like arrangement close to the foreground, as though they were on the edge of a stage. The figures have a sculptural solidity in keeping with the style that emerged in David's Roman sketchbooks, and the strength and virility of the male figures contrast with the passive, self-contained forms of the women and children. The physical separation of male and female actors underscores their formal differences. And this is another, all of that is will become very typical of David's style as a history painter. The figures were drawn from life in accordance with David's practice, and a contemporary critic exclaimed, "We can almost see the blood circulate in their veins." David transports us to ancient Rome through the severe Doric architecture of the setting, as well as the costume. Paint is applied evenly throughout, and there are no traces of the bravura brushwork characteristic of the Rococo style of painting. This painting embodies the neoclassical style that became synonymous with David's name. With the success of the Oath of the Hermitage at the Salon of 1785, and there it is, it was hung rather high because it arrived late, and it was later actually lowered from its place where you see it now. It was actually lowered to accommodate all the crowds that were flocking to see it. But I love these, period views of art installations, so I never resisted an opportunity to show one. As a result of the Oath of the Hermitage, David was hailed as the head of a new school of French painting. One critic wrote, "If we give a prize to the most vigorous history painting, we owe it to Monsieur David. His Hermitage are children created by genius." Another claimed, "One must absolutely see it to know the extent to which it merits being admired. One experiences in seeing this painting a feeling that elevates the soul." While the Oath of the Hermitage was painted for the French king, this work was a private commission, as its smaller, more domestic scale suggests. And take my word, this is much smaller than the Oath of the Hermitage, as you can see if you go uptown to the Met, where this painting now hangs. The death of the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates resonated in Enlightenment France. Socrates was admired for his adherence to his beliefs, and he chose death rather than compromising his principles. Again, the idea of self-sacrifice that recurs in David's works, and as we saw with the Oath of the Hermitage. The critic La Font de Saint-Étienne recommended this subject as a moral example as early as 1754, and 4 years later, the critic Diderot recommended as a suitable subject for artists, quote, "Socrates holding the cup in one hand and turning his eyes to heaven." Now, there's a little detail of the cup. And of course, David does not literally follow Diderot's directive, choosing instead to show the philosopher reaching for the hemlock as he continues his discourse. In his writings, Socrates' disciple Plato described his death scene, although he in fact was not present at the event. Curiously, though, David depicts Plato seated at the foot of the bed, his manuscript and quill beside him, in what is perhaps an evocation of the written account, which was likely David's source for this painting. And although Socrates was about 70 years old at the time of his death, and take a look at that Socrates in the center, that's a 70-year-old man, David, though, paints him with an idealized youthful body, and notice that Socrates is the only figure shown nude. In so doing, David evokes the use of heroic nudity in classical Greek sculpture, in which physical beauty signified moral perfection. In contrast to his idealized portrayal of Socrates, David shows his pupil Plato as an old man. And here, I cannot resist showing you a very recent Met acquisition that you might have heard about. This pen and ink drawing, lightly squared for transfer, and you can just make out the grid, the pencil grid in the drawing, represents an earlier iteration of the composition and affords a glimpse of David's working method. And what I find interesting, and just going back to the painting for a second, notice the depth that he's included in the painting with the figures in the background departing. They would be probably Socrates' wife and friends, but definitely kind of secondary characters, non-essential actors in the scene. But then notice in this drawing how it's just all foregrounded. There's no depth. It's much more kind of a claustrophobic arrangement, save for that little window, which is, again, omitted in the final version. But you might ask, how did the Met acquire this work, which, by the way, we acquired for, I think, $740, in case you haven't read about that. $740. Normally a painting by a drawing by David would have, be $700,000 rather than $740. Well, how did this happen, you might be wondering? Well, an auction house here in New York City, whose first name begins with B and ends with an S, erroneously cataloged this work as after David's painting, 19th century drawing after David. Well, first of all, if it's squared for transfer, why would it be after a painting? And secondly, if it's after David, why are they modifying the composition from what they're supposedly copying? So luckily, my colleague at the Met, Karen Stein, recognized what turned out to be a real David, not an after David, and the Met was able to get the bargain of the 21st century. To me, the bargain of the 21st century. So, back to the painting. In the final painting, as I said, David relegates the departure of Socrates' wife and family to the background. As in the Oath of the Hermitage, we remain focused on the frieze-like arrangement of figures aligned along the foreground, dramatically lit from the left, and the light source in the final painting becomes one of those off-stage, unseen light sources, as is typical of David. David uses body language to convey the drama of the moment, from Socrates' rhetorical gesture to the extreme grief of his followers and the conflicted reaction of the hemlock bearer, his executioner, in the foreground. Even he can't bear to look at Socrates as Socrates takes the fatal hemlock. And notice on the left foot of the hemlock bearer, notice how his toes are curled up in absolute tension and agony. And we'll see another set of expressive toes in a painting to come. By the way, the jailer, who's the one giving him the hemlock, had only a minor role in Plato's account, but David puts him on equal footing with Socrates. Haha, equal footing, but couldn't resist. The pun. David's composition appears all the more revolutionary when compared to a painting of the same subject by his rival Talleyrand in the same salon. And by the way, Talleyrand had bested David in one of those student competitions in the 1770s, so you know David was just gunning to overtake him at one point. Now he did. Talleyrand's work lacks the drama, compositional focus, and gestural clarity of David's. And here's one of my classic Art 100 comparisons. David on the left, Talleyrand on the right. You be the judge. Needless to say, I think if you just take a look at the two cupbearers, the one in David, and then in Talleyrand, if you can make him out among the crowd, he's the figure on the far right with something red draped over his arm, and he's carrying a tray. And to me, it looks like he's bringing Socrates, a cup of coffee or something on the tray. There's no drama in the delivery as there is in the David. So after this, 1787, Talleyrand's career was pretty much over in the face of David's triumph. And Thomas Jefferson, who was at the Salon in 1787, said that David's painting was the, quote, best thing at the Salon that year. And this by the way, would not be the last time that David would challenge a fellow artist, painting to painting. Later in his career, he would take on his students' works as well. David's image of Socrates on his deathbed would soon acquire contemporary resonance. Just for a little French history refresher moment, on July 14th, 1789, an insurrectionary mob of some 800 people stormed the Bastille prison, the popular uprising that marked the onset of the French Revolution. So there's my little visual for the storming of the Bastille. At the time, David was at work on this painting, which went on view at the Salon 6 weeks later. Continuing to mine the kind of family tragedy inherent in the Oath of the Horatii, David depicts Brutus, the founder of the Roman Republic, who condemned his sons to death for conspiring against the Republic. This Roman subject is another example of the extreme patriotism celebrated in the Oath of the Horatii. In an earlier oil sketch for the painting, David went so far as to include Brutus's sons' severed heads on pikes, and you can just make them out to the left of the column, of the far column, severed heads in the background. Now, needless to say, this subject, or this little compositional bit, would have hit rather close to home in August 1789, as several actual severed heads had been paraded around Paris the month before. And one wonders if recent events caused David to omit these severed heads from the final composition. And it would be interesting to, I think, to do an X-radiograph of the Brutus, which is now in the Louvre, to see if in fact beneath the surface of the canvas, if there are traces of those severed heads in the large final canvas. That's something I would love to know. David plays up the psychological drama by separating Brutus from the rest of his family, visualizing the divisive effects of Brutus's decision. And here's a detail of Brutus alone in the dark. The radical nature of David's compositions was not lost on his contemporaries. A fellow artist is said to have remarked, "You have in your Horatii given us 3 personages in the same plane, something never seen before. Here you have put your principal actor in shadow." The figure of Brutus, shrouded in shadows, embodies the conflict between family and state, or public and private life, that lies at the heart of the scene. Seated beside a statue representing Rome, the Roman consul clutches the letter that revealed his son's treachery, and it is his writhing feet that betray his anguish as a father. Look at his toes, they're literally curled up in maximum tension. One Salon critic saw David's Brutus as, quote, distancing himself from his family, but not yet blaming himself for his harshness. I believe I see him balancing between nature and ambition. There is no extant criticism from 1789 that explicitly condemns Brutus for sacrificing his sons to save the Republic, which is perhaps a reflection of the increasingly sacrificial tone of revolutionary propaganda, or, more likely, the fact that art criticism at the time was not a vehicle for overt social or political criticism due to the state of censorship at the time. And here, as contrast to Brutus shrouded in shadow, to read metaphorically perhaps for evil, you see, bathed in light, the women of the family, dealing with the consequences of both the son's betrayal, but also the father's decision. In Paris in 1790, at the close of a performance of Brutus, Voltaire's hit play, David's painting was staged as a living picture, or tableau vivant, flanked by busts of both Voltaire the playwright as well as Brutus. And a contemporary newspaper account reads, "Every Parisian knew David's painting. It was like a national holiday, heightened by unanimous applause." And the audience's reaction to the play itself demonstrates how much the supporters of the French Revolution identified with the story of Brutus. Quote, "When Brutus cried, 'Gods, give us death rather than slavery,' the applause and shouts were so deafening and the dust so thick that several moments were needed to restore order." David's painting of Brutus attained iconic status during the French Revolution. At the Salon of 1791, the painting was on view along with his other history paintings of the 1780s, and this would be at the height of popular support for the revolution. Their function as revolutionary propaganda has led to readings of David's history paintings as either a call to arms or as an expression of David's anti-royalist sentiments. Significantly, at no point did David ever speak of these works as metaphors of the contemporary state of French politics. Even in 1789, only weeks after a mob stormed the Bastille prison, revolting against royal authority, none of the surviving published accounts of the painting made any contemporary parallels. And in the summer of 1789, when David was painting Brutus, no one had any idea of the events to come. What can be said with certainty is that the paintings reflected the moment in which they were created, when there was a demand for history paintings to serve as moral exemplars. The Revolution of 1789 rapidly propelled David's art into the present tense. In 1792, he wrote, "We will no longer have to try to find subjects for our painting in the history of ancient peoples. No history of any people offers me anything as great or as sublime as the oath of the tennis court which I must paint." On June 20th, 1789, over 600 deputies of the Third Estate, that would be like the 99% of today, met at the tennis court of Versailles and collectively swore an oath, read by the mayor of Paris, whom you see standing on the table in the center of the composition. And they swore to unite until a constitution was established. In the summer of 1790, so a year later, David was at work on a painting that commemorated this momentous event, the formation of a new legislative body representing the people. By representing an episode from France's recent past, David redefined the territory of history painting. These men aren't Romans swearing an oath. They are the artist's contemporaries. In that respect, the work is a group portrait as well as a history painting, as we can identify the principal actors. And here's a detail on the figures on the right in which you can make out, among others, Mirabeau and Robespierre, two key figures in the revolutionary drama that would follow. And in addition to this very elaborate drawn study, David drew hundreds of studies for the individual figures, the members of the Third Estate. And these drawings, as well as the finished drawing, shows David's emphasis on differentiating the individual deputies and their responses to the moment. Yet, the shared act of oath-taking unifies the composition and reinforces the unity of the group as well. At the Salon of 1791, David exhibited this drawing at eye level, hanging it beneath the oath of the Horatii, suggestively linking his modern oath-taking with its antique counterpart. At the same time, he was at work on the drawing's monumental painted version, some 36 by 22 feet. Big, right? But of that large painting, we have only this tantalizing fragment, in the state in which it was found in 1803, abandoned by the artist. As a work in progress, it reveals David's working method. Notably, as you can see, he sketched the figures nude before painting them. And here's a comp from the figures that you can see in the painting on the right to as they appear in the finished drawing. He dresses them in the drawing. Sadly, David's first contemporary history painting was a victim of the period's tumultuous politics, outdated before it was even finished. Its heroes no longer heroes as the revolution played itself out in the 1790s. And especially notice in the fragment on the right, notice the figure on the far left with both hands clutched to his chest. That's Robespierre, who would go on and lead the bloody reign of terror. And by the time David was coming to painting his figure on the canvas, he'd already fallen out of favor and lost interest. So moving on in French history and in David's work. There the painting is the fragment as as you can see it today in a gallery in Versailles that sadly is not open to the public on a regular basis, which to me is just tragic. But there it is in situ today, what's left of it. So now, moving on. On July 13th, 1793, the journalist and radical revolutionary Jean-Paul Marat was murdered in his bath by Charlotte Corday, who had gained access to his apartment by promising to give him the name of suspects. The next day, David was asked by the National Convention to commemorate Marat in a painting. On October 16th, 3 months later, this painting was displayed in a courtyard of the Louvre. I have deliberately cited these dates to emphasize how contemporary this painting was. As history was being made, David was painting it. The art historian T.J. Clark has said that modernism began on October 16, 1793, quote, the day a hastily completed painting by Jacques-Louis David of Marat was released into the public realm. David had visited Marat the day before he was murdered, as he recalled. I found him in a pose that struck me. Near him, he had a block of wood on which ink and paper were placed, and with his hand emerging from the bathtub, he was writing his final thoughts for the good of the people. David titled his painting Marat at his last breath, and as you can see, he is still alive as David paints him, holding his quill pen and Corday's treacherous note. And here's a detail of the note. The painting reconciles two seemingly incompatible artistic ends, idealizing a hero, and Marat's body was a heroic nude, a la David's portrayal of Socrates, and it betrays no sign of his debilitating illness and disfiguring skin condition. That's why he was always taking a bath. And you can see the idealized beauty of his face. But at the same time as kind of having the mandate of idealizing a hero, at the same time, David was representing a gruesome murder, because Marat was literally, this was a bloodbath, how Marat died. And the French poet Baudelaire responded to this duality in David's painting when he saw it in 1846. Baudelaire wrote, cruel as nature, this painting possesses completely the perfume of the ideal. Where was this ugliness that holy death so quickly effaced with the tip of his wing? David's portrayal of Marat also evokes Christian iconography, his pose recalling images of the deposition or the entombment of Christ. And here's an example by Annibale Carracci. Baudelaires' description of David's painting reinforces David's allusion to religious art, as Baudelaire wrote, the divine Marat, his arm hanging from his bathtub, holding slackly his last pen, his chest pierced with a sacrilegious wound, has just given up his last breath. The water of the bathtub is red with blood. This visual parallel gains further currency as Marat himself had already been compared to Jesus in his funeral oration. Quote, like Jesus, Marat loved the people ardently. Although the background of the work is neutral, David's handling of the paint is energetic and varied, suggesting the rapidity with which he painted the work. Similar scumbled backgrounds appear in David's portraits from the same period, such as this portrait of Madame de Casterlet in the Art Institute of Chicago. The figure of Marat in his bathtub/coffin seems thrust forward into our space, standing out against the neutral ground like a sculpted relief, and the painting's vertical format recalls that of a tombstone, underscoring the commemorative function of the work. And to that point, notice David's inscription/signature on the wooden box. Marat, David. It is significant that David always referred to this work and his other portraits of revolutionary martyrs as history paintings and not portraits. Like a history painting, Marat depicts a significant moment, and there is a moral lesson inherent in this image of someone who has died for a just cause, well, at least what he believed was a just cause, a modern-day Socrates. David rejects the need for likeness associated with portraiture in favor of idealizing his subject, imbuing his portrayal with a cult-like quality. Marat becomes a martyr for the revolutionary cause. In a bizarre twist of historical fate, and likely a deliberate move on David's part, the painting of Marat was unveiled at the Louvre on the afternoon of October 16, 1793. That morning, the former Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, was guillotined. David, ever a man of his time, recorded that event as well, capturing this brutally candid image of a toothless and wigless queen en route to the guillotine as he witnessed it. David's political activism in the 1790s landed him in prison in 1794, at the moment we first encountered him this evening. During his incarceration, he also started work on a new history painting that would occupy him until 1799. He abandoned contemporary events and returned to Roman history, depicting the aftermath of the rape of the Sabines. That much more familiar and violent subject was twice painted by Poussin in the 17th century. And here is the Poussin that David could have seen on view in the newly opened Louvre Museum in the 1790s. However, David, instead of the rape of the Sabines, David chose to focus on an episode that took place 3 years after this, when an army of Sabine men attempt to reclaim their women. In the foreground, the leader of the Sabines, on the left, faces off against Romulus, the leader of the Romans. Hersilia, the Sabine woman whom you see in the center, who's the daughter of Tatius on the left and the wife of Romulus on the right. So I think you can see the kind of dilemma that she's in, coming between her father and her husband. However, she intervenes. And then, to continue the story in David's words, quote, "The feelings of conjugal, fatherly, and brotherly love spread through the ranks of both armies. Soon the Romans and the Sabines embrace to form a single people." So, happy ending. Hersilia's intervention and plea for peace resonated after a decade of revolutionary violence in France. David's contemporaries read the painting as an anti-war statement and a plea for the reconciliation of the French people in the aftermath of the revolution that divided their country, readings that David did not dispute. As Robert Rosenblum has suggested, the Roman fortress in the background reads as a reference to the Bastille in Paris, and the crowd of Romans and Sabines as a metaphor for both the mob that stormed the Bastille and subsequent revolutionary violence. Stylistically, this work marks a departure from David's Roman style, which you can see on the right, embodied in the sinewy and muscular Hermitage brothers, based on live models. And in the Sabines, David favors the lithe, smooth bodies that you see here. David explained the shift to his so-called Greek style as follows. "Perhaps I have shown too much anatomy in my painting of the Hermitage. In this one, the Sabines, I will hide it with more care and more taste." In his search for a more purified style of painting, David looked to antique sculpture as his source, just as he had done as a student in Rome in the 1770s. He was also influenced by more contemporary art, namely the engraving style of the British artist John Flaxman. Flaxman's illustrations of Homer's Iliad, published in 1793 and making the round among artists in Paris, were admired for their linear purity and simplicity. In addition, just kind of continuing the dialogue, Flaxman's engravings, in turn, were based on an earlier artistic source, namely antique Greek vase painting, with its sharply contoured forms and flattened spaces. Greek art, specifically antique statuary, also informed David's decision to use heroic nudity in his description of the male warriors, and for this he was widely criticized for the implausibility of his choice. Critics asked, "Nude warriors in battle?" And interestingly, on that note, notice the figure of Tatius at the left and his strategically placed scabbard, kind of scabbard come fig leaf. Well, that was actually a late addition to the composition that David added in 1808, so about 9 years later, when he hoped to sell the painting to Napoleon, and Napoleon hated nudity in art, not a fan, and so that was kind of done to accommodate Napoleon's taste, but it didn't work because Napoleon didn't buy the painting. But David took on his critics in 1800, who, in terms of defending his use of heroic nudity, and he cited the precedent of antique sculpture in his defense, writing, "It was a recognized custom among the painters, sculptors, and poets of antiquity to portray gods, heroes, and in general the men whom they wished to represent in the nude." So that was David's defense. David staged a private exhibition of the work, which opened in 1799, a month after a 30-year-old general, Napoleon Bonaparte, seized power in a coup d'etat. 2 years earlier, David had invited Napoleon, then a rising star, to his studio to sit for a portrait. This would be the first and last time that Napoleon posed for David. The sitting lasted for 3 hours, resulting in this unfinished portrait, which itself has also been cut down as well. Afterwards, David said to his curious students who wanted to know what this Bonaparte was like, quote, "Finally, here is a man to whom one would have raised altars in antiquity. Yes, my dear friends, Bonaparte is my hero." With the completion of the Sabines, as the 19th century dawned, David abandoned the heroes of antiquity and engaged once more with the present, as his career became bound up with that of Napoleon Bonaparte. Perpetually in a state of becoming, David would reinvent himself once again. Thank you very much.